Hi, I'm Bob Schoolcraft, pastor at Friendship United Methodist Church, Punta Gorda, Florida. I'd like to welcome you on this 29th day of August 2021, where we're in round 2 of COVID, with round 3 to come, and we'll look at COVID 4 in 2024. Just kidding you. It's not a joking matter, but it seems like it has just drug on and on and on. But this morning, I want to talk to you about listening. And this is the 29th day of August 2021. We welcome you. Do you or anyone in your family have a listening problem? Now, notice I didn't say a hearing problem. Many people have ears that work quite well. Nonetheless, they are very selective in what they hear. The story is told of King Edward VII. His grandson, Prince David, had a good relationship with his grandfather, and still David was a child, and adults in England during this period, particularly royalty, were not known to listen to children. At the dinner on one occasion, little David tried to get his grandfather's attention, and he was reprimanded immediately for interrupting the king's conversation at the table. So the young prince sat in silence until given the permission to speak. And when he was allowed finally to address his grandfather, he said, "It's too late now, Grandpa. It was a caterpillar on that lettuce, and you've already eaten it." The king should have listened to his grandson. It pays to listen to children, to friends, to co-workers, to other family members. And yet, authentic listening is very rare. Former President Bill Clinton once compared it to running a cemetery. Being president, he said, is like running a cemetery. You've got a lot of people under you, and nobody's listening. They just vote. That's my addition to that. But you've heard the old aphorism that God gave us 2 ears, but only 1 mouth, indicating that God wanted us to speak twice as much as listening, as talking. However, it could be that God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth because listening is twice as hard as talking. As someone has said, most conversations are simply monologues delivered in the presence of a witness. Sometimes, for one reason or another, we deliberately do not listen. Either we are not interested or something else has our attention. Dr. Robert Kopp tells about an old Mutt and Jeff cartoon, and I'm showing my age, and that's okay. 3/4 of a century is great, But a few of you more experienced, let me put it that way, experienced members may remember the Mutt and Jeff cartoon series. It hasn't been published for 30 or 40 years or so, but it had a loyal following in the days gone by. Mutt and Jeff had a soundproof room. And to test it, Mutt went into the room and closed the door. And Jeff yelled from outside, "Can you hear me?" And Mutt answered, "No." It's an absurd routine, of course. But sometimes we may deliberately tune out someone else. Pastor John Cramp reports that his grandmother had a unique way of ending arguments with her spouse. And if you're married, you know that we all have disagreements sometimes. When Grandma got tired of listening to her husband, she would just turn off her hearing aid. As she said, or as he said, Grandmother refused to hear anything she didn't want to hear. Grandmother's not the only one, is she? Sometimes we do not want to listen to our spouse, to our parents, to our teachers. It doesn't matter. Sometimes we may not listen because what is being said is too threatening, too painful. In one of her books, Joyce Landolph tells of a friend of hers who had just been told that she had breast cancer, and her only hope was to have a mastectomy, removing both breasts. She was crushed by the news and turned to her mother, who had not always been there for her, but she wanted her support in this time of crisis. She called her mother and asked to have lunch with her. And after they had lunch together, Joyce's friend, said to Mom, this is what Joyce's friend was reporting to us. Mom, I just received some terrible news. I have just come from my doctor's office, and I've been told that I have cancer, and it's necessary for me to have a mastectomy, Mom. And her mother replied, Your sister has the most wonderful recipe for making chicken enchiladas. And Joyce's friend tried again. Mom, you didn't hear me. I just told you that I've come from the doctor's office and I have cancer and I'm going to have surgery on Tuesday. I am scared. And her mom replied, Please don't raise your voice when you talk to me. By then, the daughter was getting desperate and shouted, Mother, please listen to me. I have cancer. I might die. I might die, Mom. And the mother replied, Don't talk to your mother in that tone of voice. I won't have it. And if you leave the enchiladas in the oven too long, they'll dry out. Now, it's evident that this piece of information was too painful for this mother to process, and so she simply tuned it out. Paul Tillich, noted theologian of a past generation, once wrote these important words. The first duty of love is to listen. And that's true. The first duty of love is to listen. Listening is particularly important in families, and that should be self-evident, but evidently it's not. There was a study some time back in San Francisco of teenage prostitutes. These young women were asked about their home life growing up. Is there anything you needed and that you needed the most and you couldn't get? Invariably, their answer, which was accompanied by sadness and tears streaming down their cheeks, was, when I needed someone most, what I needed was someone to listen to me, someone who cared enough to listen. How many children and teenagers would echo that cry? How many spouses? We all need someone who will listen. Robert Heron says that good listening is like tuning in a radio station. For good results, you can only listen to one station at a time. He says that trying to listen to his wife while looking over an office report is like trying to receive two radio stations at the same time. He ends up with distortion and frustration. Listening requires a choice of where to place your attention. To tune in to your spouse or children, you must first choose to put away all that will divide your attention. That might mean laying down the newspaper, moving away from the dishes in the sink, putting down the book you're reading, setting aside your projects. Studies show that most of us are not as good at multitasking as we think we are. When it comes to listening, there is really no such thing as multitasking. A mother named Star Peterson tells of standing at the kitchen sink, working diligently on dinner preparations, her mind totally committed to the task at hand, peeling potatoes. In the Army, she notes, they call it KP duty, and she thinks that's a good title for her task. But in her home, KP stands for kids pleasing. Mashed potatoes are for her kids' favorite foods. So when she's doing KP duty, in her mind, she is doing something that will please her kids. One day she was busy with her KP duty, and her middle son, 3-year-old Stephen, was playing nearby. And being a conscientious mother, Star's ears were tuned to her son while her eyes focused on this pile of potatoes. Within a few moments, she felt a tug at her skirt, preceded by the words, "Mommy?" And she nodded in agreement, giving some brief verbal acknowledgement as well. And there were more tugs on her skirts and more little sounds. Mommy? And again, she'd give a brief verbal comment and yet stay at her task right on KP duty. After all, she was working so hard to perform that all-important kid-pleasing task. 5 minutes passed. Stephen continued to chatter, and then she felt those tugs on her skirt again. This time, the tugs seemed harder and more persistent. And she finally put her potatoes down in the sink and bent down to her son. And Stephen took her face in his two little chubby hands, and turning directly to his line of vision to her eyes, says, Mommy, will you listen to me with your eyes? 14 years later, says Patterson, I am still learning to listen with my eyes. It's like something that Pastor Warren once noted in an issue of Rick Warren's Ministry Toolbox. He said that we spend 40% of our waking hours listening. Yet most of the time, we're only listening at 25% efficiency. And that creates many of our problems. He goes on to offer 3 what he calls hearing aids. Listen with your eyes. Approximately 80% of communication is nonverbal. Facial expressions and body language usually tell the real story. Look at people when you listen to them. Listen with your heart. Be sympathetic. Tune into the emotions behind the words. Make it a habit to take time to listen to people around you. This is to say that listening, friends, is hard work. It has to be something you are committed to. Listening to your family, listening to your coworkers, listening to those whom you come into contact with as you go about your daily business. The first duty of love is to listen. Of course, our primary responsibility is to listen to Christ. If we are poor listening to others, think how poor we are in listening to Him. Our lesson for the day is that magnificent scene on the Mount of Transfiguration. Our Master took Peter, James, and John, took them high up on the mountain where they were all alone. And there Christ was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. And Peter said to the Master, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. And Mark tells us they did not know what to say. They were so frightened. Then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud. This is my Son, whom I love. Listen to him. That has always been the Christian's primary task, to listen to Christ, for he is the one who can guide us toward better relationships and a more fulfilling life. It's like a man named Ron Mell who tells about playing golf one time at the prestigious Cypress Point Golf Course in California. At this club, each golfer is assigned a caddy. Now, Ron's caddy was an elderly gentleman by the name of Ed. At each hole, Ron asked Ed for advice, and surprisingly, each time Ed's advice seemed to Ron to be way off target. So Ron ignored Ed's advice and went with his own knowledge, experience, and instincts, and consequently, his golf game was lousy that day. And when it became obvious to Ed that his advice was being ignored, he confronted Mel. Ed made it clear that he had only one job. He had only one job, and that was to caddy this course day after day after day. Every inch of the fairway, the rough, the greens, was etched permanently in Ed's brain. And Ed, the caddy, told Ron Mel, if you want to play this course well, you have to trust what I say. Well said. Very well said. In the game of life, you and I need to listen to Christ, and we need to trust in what he says. To apply Rick Warren's hearing aids, we need to turn our eyes toward Jesus. We need to listen with our hearts, and we need to take each day for the sole task of listening. What does Christ have to say to us that we need to hear? He may want to talk with us about how we are treating family members or co-workers, church congregation members. He may want to talk about our discipleship, about our faithfulness in church, how we address not only newcomers who observe how we address members. He may want to talk about some undesirable behavior that's crept into our life. Or he may simply want to offer us encouragement as we live our daily lives. Of course, some of the things he would say to us are not things we might want to hear. Like the grandmother who turned off our hearing aid, some of us might work very hard at not listening to Christ. But we need to listen, and we need to trust him. Today's lesson is for us in particular. This is my son, with whom I am well pleased, whom I love. Listen to him. Are you willing to take that step? Are you willing to fulfill the duty of love, to listen with your eyes, listen with your heart, and to take time to listen to your family, your friends, your co-workers, and particularly to Jesus Christ? I read a story recently about that will put some of us to shame when it comes to be willing to listen. Dr. Noel Gilson, a retired doctor, tells about an 18-year-old patient of his named Mark who had developed an autoimmune reaction that left him almost completely paralyzed. He wasn't even able to speak. His parents insisted that he was a fighter and somehow he'd get through this. But meanwhile, immobile and on the ventilator, Dr. Gilson wondered how Mark was even able to ask questions or to be involved in any way in his own care. The solution was simple and at the same time quite remarkable. Mark's parents, the Orences, would sit at Mark's side each day and recite the alphabet. When they got to a letter Mark needed to spell a word, he'd nod yes. They'd write it down and they'd start all over again. Wait for him to nod. This went on hour after hour, day after day. Can you imagine that laborious task? And yet the Orences never lost patience, and Mark was involved with every decision regarding his care. Unfortunately, standard therapy wasn't helping, so Dr. Gilson proposed a risky procedure to filter Mark's blood, and Mark agreed. After the treatment, Mark showed decided improvement, and soon he could move his toes, his legs, and his arms. In fact, Mark would go on and make a full recovery, go to college, and he's doing quite well, friends. Looking back, Dr. Gilson says that he is still in awe of Mark and his parents. He calls the parents some of the most amazing people he's ever met, sitting by Mark's bed for hours, patiently listening to their child, letter by letter, waiting for that nod. Dr. Gilson says, when he saw Mark after his recovery, I wanted to tell him of my shame when my children tried to talk to me. And I brushed them off because I didn't have time to listen. I wanted to say I'd never forget him or his parents. And in her book, Listeners, Taylor Caldwell says, man does not need to go to the moon or other solar system. He does not require bigger and better bombs and missiles. His basic needs are few, and it takes little to acquire them. He can survive a small amount of bread on a small amount of bread and in the meanest shelter. But his real need, most terrible need, is for someone to listen to him. We all need someone to listen to us. But we also need to listen. We need to listen to one another, and we need to listen to Christ. A voice came from the cloud. This is my Son, whom I love. Listen to him. This is not simply good advice. It's a command from God. Amen.